Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Ryan Galloway and I'm going to talk to you about the Marine Protected Areas affirmative in your packet. So the first question you might ask yourself is, what is a marine protected area? And it is an area of ocean in which human activities are either limited or restricted altogether, and certain actions can damage marine ecosystems. So those include overfishing. If you take away too many fish, fish stocks cannot replenish. You've taken away too many fish from a given area, and therefore they cannot breed enough fish to keep the fish population at a given level. There's obviously mining of the ocean for mineral resources, which can damage the ocean, and oil and gas exploration. A lot of times these are talked about as extractive activities, which means taking something from the ocean. Right now, marine protected areas, or MPAs, cover about 6% of the ocean worldwide. So various nations, including the United States, have designated certain areas of the ocean as a marine protected area where certain human activities are limited. The next kind of question you might ask is, what kind of MPAs are there? Because an MPA isn't just one type. There are multiple types of MPAs, increasing by the degree of enforcement of the protected area. The first kind is minimally protected, which still allows a lot of extraction, or it lacks enforcement. Sometimes these are called paper MPAs because a lot of groups, especially in Europe, have designated a certain area of the ocean as a marine protected area, but it really doesn't do very much. And some people are concerned about these sort of paper MPAs because they may actually be worse than nothing, because it convinces nations that something has been done and therefore they wouldn't try and decrease extractive activities from the ocean or decrease ocean pollution because there's something already in place. A lightly protected MPA prohibits some extractive activities, but still allows commercial fishing. So when we think of fishing, we probably think of you going to the lake with your relatives and you've got a rod and reel. But commercial fishing is a lot more significant. There are huge nets put into the ocean that trap thousands of fish at a time. There's an activity called trawling, where a vessel digs up part of the ocean and gains all of the fish that are in that part of the ocean. And commercial fishing can be really damaging to marine ecosystems. The next kind of MPA is a highly protected MPA, where there are still light extractive activities like recreational fishing, more like what you think of doing. And then there's a fully protected MPA, which prohibits all extractive activity. These can also be called no-take MPAs. And as the name implies, it prohibits all extraction and all fishing. Now the plan does no-take MPAs because these are considered to be the most effective, and there's been so much damage to the ocean that we need no-take MPAs in order to solve. There's a possibility that you could, as an affirmative, do a highly protected MPA and still allow some recreational fishing, and that would provide you more protection against the politics disadvantage or the fishing industry disadvantage, which we'll talk about when we talk about the negative, but you would lose some solvency from the benefits of no-take MPAs. So what does the plan do? The plan says the United States federal government should designate 30% of ocean territory in each major geographic ocean region of the United States as a no-take marine protected area. So the first question is the United States federal government. Well, the plan doesn't specify an agent, but actually when marine protected areas and marine national monuments have been done in the past, they've been done by the president via executive order. So probably normal means of the plan would be that Biden would designate these areas of the ocean as marine protected areas under the Antiquities Act. There's some debate as to whether or not presidents should have power under the Antiquities Act of 1906 to declare marine national monuments, which can also be marine protected areas, but it's largely considered to be okay, and it's been done before by both President George W. Bush and Obama. The next question you might ask is why 30%? And that's because there's an international goal of trying to protect 30% of ocean areas by 2030. And the plan would align itself with the goal of protection of these ocean areas. Now, the plan itself in its current manifestation does not specify when this has to be done by. The assumption would be it would be done as soon as possible, but you might be able to get away with saying you could do this by 2030, and then you could still solve for the international goal. We also should talk about how each major geographic ocean region is in the plan, because currently MPAs are in remote areas of the Pacific. So the United States actually has a lot of MPAs. They're just in remote areas, and there's one very large MPA in an area of Hawaii, which is most of the MPAs that the United States has. But we don't have it around most coastal areas of the United States, and we don't have it in some of the most geographically biodiverse areas that are needed to be protected. And we already talked about no-take marine protected areas. So the next question you might ask is, we talked about of the United States, and so what kind of ocean areas does the U.S. control? And international law provides two different definitions of what the United States controls. The first is the U.S. territorial sea, which extends from 12 nautical miles from the shore. So we control a certain area of the ocean that is 12 nautical miles from the United States. So there's a big long discussion of the law of the sea and the history of common law in this area, but nations are considered to control an ocean area 12 nautical miles from the shore. The second kind of area we control is the exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, which extends 200 miles from the territorial sea. Now, there is a topicality debate to be had as to whether or not the exclusive economic zone is part of the waters of the United States. The resolution says the plan has to be in the United States. There are cards which are included in the affirmative that say the national waters of the United States include the EEZ, but if you're worried about topicality, I think there is not much downside to doing the U.S. territorial sea for topicality purposes, but it would hurt your solvency. But if you're worried about T, you could do 30% of the U.S. territorial sea and argue you solve via international spillover effects. However, if you're more worried about solvency than topicality, you can argue that the plan is done in the EEZ and is 30% of the EEZ and rely upon the definition of national waters of the United States, because the resolution says water resources and argue that those ocean resources are in the U.S. So the next question you might ask is, what kind of ocean protections does the United States currently have? What is the inherency of the affirmative? And the first sort of background thing to understand is the Magnuson-Stevens Act. And here's a picture of Magnuson and Stevens, and they are the ones that created the law. It's the primary U.S. law governing marine fishing in U.S. waters. It was created in 1976, and it was designed to prevent overfishing. And I talked about this a little bit before, but if you take away too many fish from an ocean area, they can't repopulate. So you actually hurt the fishing industry in the long run by not putting limits on the amount of fish that can be taken out. And this fisheries management is designed to prevent our fish stocks from not falling into disrepair, from not collapsing to where there would be no fish. Now, a limitation of the Magnuson-Stevens Act as compared to the affirmative is it only deals with fishing and not other forms of extractive activities like we talked about before, mining, oil and gas exploration, those kinds of things which can hurt the ocean. So you might also ask, what kind of MPAs does the U.S. currently have? And actually, the U.S. has a fair amount of its ocean space covered by an MPA. Approximately 26% of the U.S. ocean space is currently covered by an MPA. Now you might ask, so the plan only covers 4% more of the U.S. ocean space? That doesn't sound like a whole lot. Well, here is the reason why the plan is important. It's because that 97% of those MPAs are in areas of the remote Pacific, not only around Hawaii, but a lot of territories that the United States controls in the Pacific, like Guam, are areas that we protect with MPAs. We don't protect areas around the continental United States. So the Gulf of Mexico, the Mid-Atlantic, the North Pacific have no highly to fully protected MPAs. And there are a great many species around the continental United States that are arguably critical to biodiversity, critical to the health of the ocean, which are not currently protected by an MPA. So you might ask yourself, well, now I know what an MPA is, but why would you want to establish more MPAs? And the first reason why is to protect the ocean. And the beginning premise, the problem, is that the world's oceans are under threat. There's overfishing, there's loss of marine biodiversity, lots of fish species have died, lots of underwater animals have died, there's destructions of the coast, there's pollution, there's warming, which are all threatening the oceans. Another phenomenon specific to the oceans is ocean acidification. As the ocean warms, it becomes more acidic. Its pH balance, for those of you that have studied chemistry before, becomes more acidic, and that threatens marine life, in particular coral reefs. And then you would argue that if the oceans die out, we're going to have some significant problems. The oceans are vital to life on Earth. So phytoplankton, or very small animals at sea, create 50% of the oxygen we breathe. So we need the ocean, we need healthy oceans so we can have oxygen to breathe. Furthermore, the ocean consumes CO2 or carbon dioxide. I'll talk more about this in a future slide, but the oceans are protecting us from global warming. The oceans suck up a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere and serve as a check on global warming. Furthermore, the oceans are a source of food for billions. While we probably don't think about this much in the United States, there are many nations that heavily rely upon fish populations for their food, especially island nations like Japan rely heavily on fish for their food resources. And furthermore, there are millions of jobs created by the ocean. There's fishing, there's shipping, there's manufacturing interests dealing with the shipping industry, there's shipbuilding, there's all kinds of industries that rely heavily on the oceans. I should probably also mention tourism. A lot of people like to go to the beaches, a lot of people like to go to Hawaii, and healthy oceans are necessary for those jobs. I'll also mention something specific about the oceans, which are coral reefs. And coral reefs are undersea organisms. They're actually colonies of coral polyps that are held together by calcium carbonate. So this coral reef, which you can see here, is actually multiple different coral polyps held together in that reef. Something I did not know, perhaps you knew, but I did not know, is coral reefs are animals and not plants. Now, why do we care about coral reefs? Well, you can sort of see from the picture that fish rely upon coral reefs as their habitat. 25% of marine life rely upon coral reefs for their habitat. So they're very crucial to the oceans. And there's good evidence that says coral reefs are key to life on Earth. So we want to protect these corals. The second advantage is climate change. And as I mentioned before, oceans serve as a check on global warming. A key phrase you should know is that oceans are a carbon sink. They suck up carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So one thing they do, as this picture illustrates, is they dissolve certain amounts of CO2 in the water. They also sequester carbon, which means they trap that carbon and don't let it out, which means a good amount of carbon dioxide is sucked up into the ocean and not let into the atmosphere where it can cause global warming. The authors in the 1AC say that the ocean should be looked at not only as a victim of climate change, but as a potential solution to climate change. Furthermore, even if you can't solve all of climate change, there's good evidence that healthy oceans provide a check on the worst harms of climate change. So they help mitigate and check climate change even if it doesn't solve it altogether. So you can sort of claim a benefit of mitigating, checking, not allowing the worst impacts of climate change. And as you can imagine, there are big impacts to climate change. The first is just human extinction. There are people who say that if the Earth continues to warm at the rate it's warming, that it will turn the Earth's atmosphere into Venus, and we will no longer be able to live on the Earth. There's also good evidence that climate change will cause wars, wars over water, wars over food, wars over resources, which we no longer have. And there's good evidence, and I think you can capitalize on the recent literature surrounding the coronavirus that says that climate change causes disease, and that climate change forces us into areas of the world where we haven't been before, where we chop down forests, where we cause new areas of disease to become unlocked by melting permafrost, and we'll have a bunch of new diseases which can obviously create problems. Then we talk about the solvency, and there are actually two components of the solvency, one domestic and one international. First of all, MPAs themselves allow marine habitats to heal from damage done by humans. Well, the evidence indicates that most of the damage done to the ocean is actually done by human beings. It's done by overfishing, it's done by extractive activities like oil and gas development. And if you prevented that damage to large sections of the ocean that were key to biodiversity, the ocean could heal and recover. And actually, the reverse causal solvency evidence, which you usually have evidence which says, well, this is a problem, and then you sort of infer that if you got rid of the source of the problem, that you would solve the problem. But the evidence that MPAs actually cause areas to recover is pretty good. But there's a second component to the affirmative, which is meeting this 30 by 2030 commitment or 30 by 30 commitment, i.e. 30% of the ocean protected by 2030. And you would argue that the plan is modeled internationally, that the U.S. is a leader in conservation, and that other nations will follow the United States, and they'll create their own MPAs, solving for the ocean around the globe. And if you solve the ocean, not only do you protect the Earth, not only do you protect life on Earth because the ocean is considered to be fundamental to life on Earth, but you also mitigate and help solve climate change, which are the primary two benefits of this affirmative.